thank you for coming out on this cold and rather dreary night, although I don't know that I've ever been so happy to see the rain after our many prayers. But my name is Stephanie Blank. I am the board chair of GEEARS, the Georgia Early Education Alliance for Ready Students, and I am so happy that you are all here for a very special speaker series event. But before we get started, I wanted to take one moment to recognize our board members who are here. Jay Berkelhammer, where's Jay? Todd Green. Todd, are you in the room? Todd may still be networking outside. And First Lady Sarah Elizabeth Reed, it's over here. So thank you for our board members who are in attendance. But GEEARS is here to do several things, but one is to build a statewide movement of business people, civic leaders, parents, philanthropists, educators, to support high-quality early learning throughout our state. And one of the things that we have learned is that with these opportunities to increase public engagement and knowledge, it also creates excitement and new supporters. Once people hear the message and really understand why early education makes such a difference in the outcomes of our children, a light bulb kind of comes on, and they really get it, and they're there with us. And one of the things, despite how you may feel about the recent election, whether you were a yay or a nay, one thing that did happen, which Mindy and I talked about, it was such a bright spot for us to see, was that several early education initiatives around the country all passed. So what that tells us is that we have kind of reached a tipping point where both sides of the aisle recognize the importance of early learning, and I think that bodes really well for the future. So that was very heartening to see. But one of the ways that we create energy and excitement around this is doing these roundtable series on early childhood and public policy, which is now, and it's hard to believe that this is its third year, but we want to especially thank the Gazweta Foundation. Is there anyone here from Gazweta tonight? They are not, but their funding has made this possible. And we really want to have these speaker series events be not only interesting, but maybe sometimes provocative and push a little in the things that we're hearing. A lot of us have very set ideas sometimes about early childhood and what should happen during those formative years. And science sometimes can turn that on its ear a little bit. And I don't know if any of you have read the book Nurture Shock. That one did that a little bit for me. So, but we want to provide a contemporary perspective on the issues particularly facing us here in Georgia. We want to create dialogue. We want you to leave this building today and go out and continue this discussion. One of the things that we have learned in doing this and speaking to so many public officials in particular is that we think that people will know these issues, and we get out there and we find that they don't. So it's up to us to help educate everyone we come across about why this is so important. Some of you have been here to hear Linda Espinoza, or Paul Tuff, Wes Moore, Rob Grunwald. We've had some exceptional people to come and speak about this. And so we are now asking our speakers, having done this several times, to give several presentations throughout the day when they are with us, either through workshops or smaller group discussions, before the day culminates in a keynote address that you will hear in just a little while. And we think that this format provides the ability for stakeholders to engage with the experts and get that conversation going, but also to be able to focus it more locally around the issues that are important to you guys as well. So we are thrilled to have so many wonderful relationships and partners in the community. And we are thrilled that because of the attention that Georgia has paid to early childhood education, we are able to bring amazing speakers in like you're going to hear tonight. But one of our most valued partners is the Georgia Department of Early Care and Learning, better known as DECAL, who hosted a workshop with our speaker today for their employees this afternoon. And DECAL Commissioner Amy Jacobs is here this evening and is going to introduce our speaker for us. Amy.
Before leaves us. I hear it is your birthday today on this very rainy Monday. So here's a little treat for you to enjoy. You don't have to share it with us. Take it with you and enjoy it.
This is how important early childhood education is to me. And I am here on my birthday.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. It is truly my honor for me to introduce our speaker today. In doing so, I'm not going to rehearse his educational background or his work experience, as you'll find that information about his position at the Fred Rogers Center and his impressive credentials in his bio on this evening's agenda. I first had the opportunity to hear today's presenter at a plenary session at the 2016 QRIS National Meeting in New Orleans. The title of his presentation that day was, "What is Simple and Deep?" He took the title from a quotation of one of our field's giants, Fred Rogers. Mr. Rogers said, "Deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex." What I remember most about the presentation was when he went on to identify what he believes is the most important ingredient for promoting positive child development. This ingredient is simple, yet profound. It is relationships and connections, and those interactions between children and the significant adults in their lives. And in our context, it's our early care and education teachers. Our presenter's message that day helped distill for me that we must equip Georgia's early care and education professionals with skills to effectively interact and connect with the children in their care. According to our presenter, without doing so, other factors like curriculum, professional learning, processes, programs, educational technology, and more cannot have optimal impact on child development. I am privileged to introduce to you Dr. Junlei Li. Dr. Li has certainly demonstrated his commitment to children today, having already conducted 2 workshops. I asked him how he did it, and he said he's running on pure adrenaline, and now he's going to share with us. So thank you, Dr. Li, for the seeds you have planted in my thinking that day in New Orleans, and thank you what you have brought to Georgia today. I present to you Dr. Junlei Li.
Well, good evening. So glad to see you all. And usually I like to start by saying it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. I don't want to sound phony, but for the plants, it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood today. Thank you so much for coming, and I know there's a few of you who know me, but for most of you, I know you didn't come here to listen to me. You came here because someone else's name is on the program, and that is Mr. Rogers. And that's what I hope to do tonight, to share with you Fred's legacy in early childhood, but more importantly, what Fred would have said about kind of what is it that we're doing today in early childhood. And some of the challenges from Fred isn't going to be easy, even in today's context. First of all, I come from a small town in Pennsylvania. That's where I live and work and teach. And it's the town of Latrobe, Pennsylvania. The reason we're there is because this is Fred's hometown. He was born and raised in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, all the way through high school. And so when he retired from television and he thought about establishing the Fred Rogers Center, he ended up deciding to locate it in St. Vincent College in the town of Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And where we live is about 5 minutes from the house where Fred was actually born. Now, my host this afternoon just took me to Dr. King's neighborhood, so I'm so glad to be in between these 2 beautiful neighborhoods. This was one of my favorite pictures that an old neighbor gave it to me. And in 1934, this was the first grade classroom in on Main Street in the small town of Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And one of those children is Mr. Rogers. It was given to me by one of his classmates. I don't know if you can spot him. I don't know from where you sit. If you can spot him. There used to be this game called Where's Waldo, right? Where you try to look for the one that's a little different from the rest of the children. So I'll pop him up right here. Right, so front row, center, right? Now I know there are teachers in this room, and if you're a teacher in 1st grade, and who's the little boy you put in front row center closest to you? It's usually the boy that has a mind of his own, right? And for most of you, for all of you, that little boy with a mind of his own went on to produce first Children's Corner and eventually Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood for the next 4 decades or so. And for many of you, I'm glad to know that it has been part of your growing up or your children's growing up, or for some of you, maybe your grandchildren's growing up as well. Okay, so for all of you who are here, I just wanted to take you down to memory lane just a little bit, no matter which decade with which you become engaged in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I wanted to share with you just something that maybe jot your memory.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Would you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you, so let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, you be mine, you be mine, you be my neighbor. Won't you please, please won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please won't you be my neighbor?
So there's something that's constant about Fred. And that's what I hope to spend some time talking about today. That you can imagine from the days when the television program was broadcast on black and white to all the way to the 2000s, the world has changed. Everything about it, right? From its politics to its technology, to its expectations for children. But the constancy of Fred is not just his style, the programming style, but his fundamental convictions about what do children need and what does it mean for children to grow up to become human beings. And these things, in Fred's world, didn't change. And one of the challenges that we have at the Fred Rogers Center is to often ask ourselves the question, what would Fred Rogers do, right? On whatever issue or projects that we are working on today. And it's quite an impossible question to answer. And usually when we travel, people invite us because they're interested in that question as well. And often I have conversations with Mrs. Rogers, Mrs. Joanne Rogers, who's the chair of our organization. And I would go to her and we were talking about some specific issues and I would bring up a question, what do you think Fred would do? And Joanne would always say, I have no idea. She said, I've been married to this man for all these years and he never ceases to surprise me. Right? And so Joanne would never say what Fred would do, but what Joanne did tell us was this idea that, well, you're not gonna know what Fred would do, right? Because Fred died. But what you could do is you can find out what did Fred Rogers do. Right? And then Joanne would tell us, then the most important question, right, is what are you gonna do? Now that you know what Fred did do, what are you gonna do about it? Right? And so these are the kind of process by which we think through a lot of these things. I think over the course of maybe the last 2 years, I find myself often thinking about a year in the United States where we have much turmoil within the country and abroad. Right? We have conflicts abroad, we have rising racial tensions within our own borders, we have elections that are marred by threats of violence and actual violence. And that was the year 1968. The year 1968 is of special significance because that's the first year that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was broadcast nationally. But the year 1968 has also special significance in the history of our country and going all the way back to the neighborhood right here in Atlanta. It's the year that the lives of 3 little boys who were born about 5 years from each other were juxtaposed together, right, through fate and destiny. The oldest of them is the boy that grew up in this neighborhood, right, Dr. King. And if we remember that part of the history, in 1968, in April, on April 3rd, Dr. King went to Memphis, Tennessee to join and support the strikes of the sanitation workers. And on the night of April 3rd, Dr. King had the famous "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, right, where he foreshadowed that his life may not be long, but it doesn't matter, that he's been to the mountaintop and he has seen the promised land, and he thinks we can get there one day. The next day, Dr. King was shot and killed. Now that night, on April 4th, that night, the youngest of the boys was Bobby Kennedy. Bobby was running for the nomination of the Democratic Party, and his plane landed in Indianapolis, and when he got off the plane, he found out that Dr. King has been shot and was killed. And the police escort backed off because Bobby was to deliver his speech in downtown Indianapolis on a night where there were riots across the major cities throughout the country, but Bobby decided to go anyway. And it was a historical speech that Bobby made extemporaneously. He crumbled up the speech notes that his aides gave him and started to talk. It was a significant speech because it was the first time Bobby referred to the death of his own brother, John F. Kennedy, just a few years early. And Bobby concluded the speech with these words that let's dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. And fast forward 2 months, in June, Bobby Kennedy all but clinched the Democratic nomination, and in California, in Los Angeles, in a hotel, he thanked his supporters, and on exiting the hotel, Bobby Kennedy was shot and killed. And that night in Pittsburgh, the young Fred Rogers, into the very first year of the national broadcast of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, when the news finally reached Pittsburgh, Mr. Rogers was distraught. He has been struggling with everything that was happening throughout that whole time, but that night he was distraught. But at the same time, he felt we've got to do something. So Fred and his staff worked continuously for the next 24 hours to want to put on a primetime special that was going to air on the educational television so that parents and families dealing with these tragedies and feeling just as helpless dealing with these tragedies can have a voice, can have a source in that context. And it was incredibly difficult, not just physically exhausting, but it was emotionally draining for Fred. And Fred's mentor, Dr. Margaret McFarland, was in the control booth of the studio. That in between takes, Fred would break down and Fred would go into the studio and talk to his mentor privately before he goes back on the set to retake and retake. And I just wanted to share with you just a glimpse of what Fred tried to put together to air the day after Bobby Kennedy died.
Hi. You know, I'm a parent of 2 boys, and I care deeply about my family. And as you know, I care deeply about children. And I've always been glad to be able to share the kind of work that I like to do for children with the parents, the grown-ups, who are with children most. And so I'm grateful for a chance now to visit with you, especially at this disturbing time in our nation's history. Children have very deep feelings, just the way parents do, just the way everybody does. And our striving to understand those feelings and to better respond to them is what I feel is the most important task in our world. Unique ways in which children express their feelings come through play. Play is the way that children talk to us best.
And I think you can feel the weight that Fred felt, but he still felt that it was so important, even in times like this, to talk about what children need and to talk about what it is that we can do to support children as well as the families. And the program was finished, and it aired on the night of June 7th, ahead of June 8th, which is the nationally broadcast memorial service for Bobby Kennedy. And Fred wanted to make sure that the families and children had a chance to see the primetime program ahead of the funeral. He encouraged families to join together to watch the memorial service, and he encouraged parents and children to be able to talk about it. And that has been Fred's philosophy when it comes to childhood all along. And it was at that funeral, if you remember, that the lone surviving brothers of the Kennedys, Edward Kennedy, ended the eulogy by saying, "Some men see things as they are and ask why." And speaking of Bobby, Ted Kennedy said, "I dream of things that never were and say, why not?" And in a way, starting from 1968 or even long before that, Mr. Rogers was one of those who dreamed of the things that never were and asked why not. And at least within the context of television, produced Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And of course, from there he went on. It wasn't just 1968. He went through to continue to produce the show through the rest of the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, through September 11th, and so on. Now, on every occasion in which children and family had a need, Fred tried to step up. And I think I was caught by this particular passage in Fred's reflection about the context in which Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood has been completed, that how great it is that when we come to know that times of disappointment can be followed by times of fulfillment, that sorrow can be followed by joy, that guilt over falling short of our ideals can be replaced by pride in doing all that we can, and that anger can be channeled into creative achievement and into dreams that we can make come true. And that is the essence of his effort to produce Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And at the center, we tried to understand ongoingly what Fred's thinking was behind different parts of the neighborhood and the different part of his convictions that remained unchanged from the 1950s onward. And for us, it came down to three broad areas, particularly in early childhood. The idea that each of us, whether we are very young children or whether we are grown-ups, that we learn and grow best through relationships, human beings with whom we connect. That of all the things we need to learn, that to Fred, the most important part is about growing on the inside, right? Who we are. And lastly, that it's not technology that dictate and give meaning to our lives, it's that we give meaning to the technologies in our own lives. These things are kind of easier to talk about, but once we dive into it, each of them present significant challenges in reconciling it with the world in which we work. And tonight I just wanted to focus on connecting some of the dots and focus on kind of what really ought to be the goal of early childhood education, a fundamental question. Right? We know a lot about the means, but what ought to be the goal of early childhood education? And here's where we struggle at the Fred Rogers Center. We struggle in particular with answering the question, what would Fred Rogers do, or what did Fred Rogers do? Sometimes it feels much more appropriate that the title of my talks should be, Fred Rogers said what? Because there are so many points in which we have to reconcile and continue to wrestle with Fred's legacy and the world as it is today. And I wanted to show you, this is the Fred that most of you probably can remember, right? Besweatered, kind, sweet, gentle. Many of us love Fred Rogers. We love what he has to say, in part because sometimes we agree with him, right? Or at least we fancy that he agrees with us, right? But in my office hangs this picture. There's not a lot of these around, but this is actually my favorite picture. Fred has that intense side. And you got a glimpse of that, right, in the Bobby Kennedy special that Fred did. But many of those who have worked with Fred since the 50s would tell us that Fred had the famous steely stare. In staff meetings, in production meetings, script meetings, if something doesn't feel right, Fred gets quieter and quieter until he develops that steely stare. And everyone eventually sees it, and the whole room would quiet down. And Fred invariably has something that he has to say and get off his chest. And I wondered often, even in our own work, whether Fred looked upon our work and we would see this Fred or we would see this Fred. Right? What would Fred think of the work and the system in which we have built for children? I want to share with you a glimpse of that edgier, sharper Fred from the very beginning of the show. This was in 1967, where they're still producing the first episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
I don't think that anybody can grow unless he really is accepted exactly as he is. Because if somebody's always saying to a child, you're going to grow up and you're going to be fine. So much of that in this country anyway, you know, that a child is appreciated for what he will be, not for what he is. He will be a great consumer someday. And so the quicker we can get them to grow up, and the quicker we can get them out of the nest so that they will go out and buy, you know, set up their own home at 12, maybe, and then that.
So I'm always fascinated by this side of Fred. Right? Most of you probably haven't seen it. And this may not be what you were expecting to see when you came here to hear about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And none of our hosts are responsible for it because they have no idea that this is what I was talking about tonight. But back to kind of what is the goal of early childhood. I remember about a decade ago, I found this little brochure that Fred and his staff helped to develop, I think perhaps in the late 70s or 80s, about helping parents and children talk about going to school, right? And going to school at that time meant going to first grade, okay? And this was one leaf of the brochure, and I'm just gonna blow up the words all the way on top, right? You don't have to know your letters and numbers when you first go to school. School is a place where people learn about such things. And that was about going to first grade. Now, we have two options, right? We can read something like that, well, clearly Fred was outdated, that was in the back 1980s, right? It's not particularly relevant, the world has changed. Or we have to face it and go, okay, what has changed? And why have we changed it? Right? And these are the challenges I think we grapple with every day, and I'm here not to share with you any conclusions, but to trigger conversations. Because Fred's philosophy from the 60s onward did not change. So in Fred's mind, right, what is important to him through the television program, as well as through everything else he did, was to help children grow on the inside. And the way Fred defines that is that it may be that the most important mastery we achieve early on is not the mastery of a particular skill or a particular piece of knowledge, but rather the mastery of patience and persistence that learning requires, along with the ability to expect and accept mistakes, and the feelings of disappointment that these mistakes may bring. Okay? These are the type of things that Fred was talking about as what he thought was the most important things for young children to develop prior to getting to school, and perhaps as a lifelong habit. Now, Fred Rogers rarely got involved in policy talks or systems talks. So the closest I can find in terms of a policy statement coming from Fred is a segment coming from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And I want to tell you ahead of time that it's a relatively long segment. It's about 7 minutes. But it's worthwhile to play it in its entirety. Usually, we don't play videos that long, and Fred himself doesn't. But as I was coming here, I was mindful that about 33 years ago, Mr. Rogers came to Atlanta and delivered the very first of his 3 speeches, eventually, to the National Association of Education of Young Children. That was his very first speech to the National Association. He did it right here in Atlanta. And he showed this segment in its entirety. Right? That was what he wanted to share with the educators from all across the country in 1983. So I wanted to have an opportunity to share that with you now. And this came from the week of programming, 5 episodes called Going to School, that was filmed in 1979. And the reason it was important is because most of you may not know this, but from 1976 to 1979, Fred stopped producing Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. At the time, not intending to ever return. He thought he has produced enough about the different topics in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and he was getting ready to serve a grown-up audience. He wanted to do programs for adults. So for 4 years, he actually stopped producing Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But then as he sensed there is great need in the country, in our families and children for this kind of programming, that he needed to go deeper and bolder into areas that he hasn't gone before. So he decided to come back, and this was the very first week of programming that brought him back. And the programming topic was going to school.
F, G, X, Y, 1, 7, 2, 4. Oh my.
I brought you milk.
Oh, thank you, Lady Evelyn.
When you called for it, I thought you sounded a little sad.
Would you hold it while I get a straw, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Here. Just like a couple sips now.
Did you hear what I said about being sad?
Yes, I did. A, B, C, D, F, G, J, K, L, M, S. Oh, Lady Evelyn, I just can't go to school tomorrow.
Why not, Daniel?
Because I don't know everything.
You don't know everything? I don't understand.
Well, Lady Elaine said that we couldn't go to school if we didn't know all the letters and all the numbers on these charts. And I've tried and tried to learn them, but I just can't, so I guess I can't go. And I wanted to go to school, I really did.
But Daniel, Lady Elaine is just plain wrong. You don't need to know everything before you begin. In fact, that's what school is for. To help you to learn, not to scare you.
How do you know?
Well, because I went to school, and I didn't know those things when I started.
What was it like at your school?
Oh, Daniel, I loved it. I had a teacher who really wanted to be a teacher, and every morning she would welcome us and make us feel as though we were all going on a kind of trip together.
What sort of trip?
Trip to someplace new, someplace we had never even thought of. We learned so many things about the world and about different countries and people and ships and stars and planes.
And trucks?
Yes, and trucks and cars and flowers and about how some people like some things and some people like other things.
But what about the letters and the numbers?
Oh, we learned those too, but that was why we were learning about everything else, not all by themselves.
And did you play?
Of course we play. Teachers know that children need to play. In fact, That's one of the reasons Harry Elizabeth Cow wanted to have the school at someplace else, so that she could have a big playground.
Will it have sand in it?
Well, it probably will.
And what will the school be like inside?
Well, there will be chairs that will be just the right size for children and young tame tigers. And there will be desks that you can put milk on. And
Will Harriet Cow give us milk?
oh, of course. Almost every school gives children milk.
And time to go to the bathroom?
Of course. You can go to the bathroom whenever you have to.
It doesn't sound so bad as Lady Elaine makes it sound.
I'm just going to go talk with her. I don't understand why she'd be scaring people so much about school. You call me again if you need me, Daniel.
I will, Lady Evelyn. And thanks a lot.
Oh, you're welcome, Daniel. You have so many people who love you. Maka-muka.
Akamaka, Lady Evelyn.
2 plus 1 equals 3. Now say that again.
2 plus 1 equals something.
I don't know why you can't get it. Oh, hello there, Evelyn.
Lady Elaine,
Oh, yes.
I'd like to talk with you.
Sorry, I don't have time. You all are starting that school tomorrow, and I don't have any of these children ready. Now, 2.
The children in this neighborhood were ready long before you started drilling them.
What are you saying?
I'm saying that I don't like the way you are frightening these children. You're telling them things that are just not true.
2 plus 1 equals 3 is most certainly true.
That's right, but Anna doesn't need to know that before she goes to her first day of school.
No, she needs to know much more than that.
She already knows much more than that.
What do you mean?
Anna knows that she's a growing platypus who wants to learn and be with other children. She already knows how to play lots of different things. She knows what she likes to eat and what her favorite toys are.
What does that have to do with school?
It has a lot to do with school, a lot to do with learning.
I don't understand your pedagogy.
Wanting to learn is the most important part of learning.
I want to learn to read, like my mom and dad.
Well, your teacher will help you learn to read, Anna.
How can you learn to read without knowing all the letters?
Give the teacher a chance, Lady Elaine. Incidentally, what was your first day of school like?
Mine? Oh, I had a wonderful time. The teacher had games for us to play and milk to drink, all sorts of treats.
Did you know all your letters and numbers when you got there?
Well, not exactly.
Did you have to know everything?
Not exactly.
Did you have a playground?
Oh, what a fabulous playground we had. I remember I used to pretend I was an astronaut and fly all over the place.
And then when you grew up, you got to be an astronaut.
Do you think my playing about it had something to do with it?
Do you?
I wonder.
Knowing how to play well is one of the most important things of all in getting ready for the first day of school.
Okay, Evelyn. Take this green board to Harriet Cow. She'll have some fine players coming to her school tomorrow.
You are a good sport, Lady Elaine.
I learned to be by playing. Come on, Emma. I'll show you some really neat stuff inside this museum.
What about the letters and numbers?
Oh, you'll have plenty of time for that when you get to school. See you, Evelyn.
Goodbye, friend.
Come on, dear. Lots of stuff in here.
So, we could probably stop here and just have a whole discussion about it, but I present this not to ask you to either agree or disagree, right? But in many ways, the storylines in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood was a reflection of the needs of the children and families in the real world, that Mr. Rogers would not have put a program on without having first heard about these needs through the countless letters, about 3,000 a year, that he reads in response to for the entire program, period. And as kind of in a way, some of these stories serve as parables, right? And some of the policy debates, that's embedded in these stories are probably as relevant today as it might have been in 1978 or in the 1980s. And how does that vision of school, how does that vision of learning, and how does that vision of what it means to be ready to learn reconcile with our current implementations? Right? And it does not reconcile easily. For example, in my home state, Pennsylvania, this is the index of the early learning standards. Right? The kind of things the children need to know before they start, not first grade, kindergarten. Right? And first and foremost in these standards is reading and math. Being able to read and being able to do math. And just as a thought experiment, I did this with our home state's document, that if you counted up all the words in the early learning standards document, right, it has 5 times as many words as the United States Constitution, plus all of its 27 amendments. So it takes a lot more effort to specify what children need to know before they enter kindergarten than it takes to operate a country. Right? And I didn't do that count for Georgia, but this is the index of the Georgia Early Learning Standards. And the orange and the yellow area combined are the skills and the knowledge component. And this blue bar right here is the social-emotional development. So even on coverage, you have a sense of where the emphasis is prior to getting school ready. But in addition to thinking about whether all of this reconcile well with Fred Rogers' legacy, in early childhood we have a tradition of relying on research. So how does this vision reconcile with the research in early childhood? For those of you who are familiar with early childhood research, the most famous studies that really gave the initial impetus for system and policy change and funding change in this country are studies that are called peri-preschool and abecedarian and so on. These are the studies that really made the fundamental argument about return on investment, $7 to 1, etc. What did we find when it comes to what is important for children to master before going to school in the peri-preschool and abecedarian studies? Here's a chart. I'm just going to briefly explain through this. But this chart, the red line and the blue line refers to the IQ scores of children. The red line are those children who went to these preschool programs, and the blue lines are those who did not. I'm just going to go zoom in to one of them so that you can see a little clearly. Peri-preschool, the first and perhaps one of the most famous studies. See how these lines start off about the same? You expect that? And then they split wide open, right, around the age of 4, 5, and then they close in by 3rd grade. Which means at least on the more cognitive dimensions, what early childhood education can provide is a temporary blip, but eventually the closing in. This would have been an anomaly if it was just peri-preschool, but it was for abecedarian as well. And we find the same pattern in the longitudinal evaluation of Head Start and early Head Start. And we're starting to see that pattern in various evaluations across different states. So it seemed fairly consistent that at least when it comes to cognitive dimensions, you see these early gains, and then that's not where early education seemed to be making the difference. But that does not mean that early education does not make a difference. It just means we have to be patient and not impose short-term gains, short-term outcomes onto early education programs and expect early education programs to justify themselves by very short-term gains, particularly in the cognitive domain. The research does not have a clear answer. Right? So if you ask the top researchers, they have speculations as to exactly what it is that is to be gained. They can't tell you exactly what it is just yet. But one thing we do know for sure is that even of the peri-preschool and Epsidarian, even when the cognitive gains closed in, if you follow these kids all the way forward, right, the red bars here all refers to the outcomes of children who have attended the preschools, and the blue bars, those who did not. Outcomes all the way to adulthood clearly shows the strength of having been there. This little blip is special education enrollment. That's the only one that's flipped, and reasonably so. So what the science seemed to be pointing out is that even when you don't have these early cognitive gains, you can still expect to see longer-term outcomes, possibly, if the programs are good. And that's a very different kind of a picture. Right? Does this research justify the way that we expect our children to learn about those knowledge and skills and acquire them and master them prior to entering even kindergarten? Or do these research are pointing to that there's something else that is being developed when children are young? So Mr. Rogers mentions and sets as a criteria for his own work that deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex. And one time I was trying to wonder if Mr. Rogers were to write the early learning standards, what would it be? Right? And he did. So in 1983, in the very first book that Fred wrote for parents, there was a chapter in which he laid out what he called the 6 fundamentals of learning readiness, what helps someone to be ready to learn, not just for children, but for older kids and adults as well. And so this is his list. It may appear simultaneously familiar and alien to you, familiar in the sense that you can identify with it, alien in the sense that you may not see all of them in the policy documents. Self-worth, trust self, trusting others, curiosity, capacity to listen and look carefully. If you don't have that, you can't read. If you don't have that, you can't draw. Capacity to play. And the last one is solitude. The capacity to be willing to be alone. Not only from other people, but from all the gadgets as well. So for Fred, in his simple and deep way, these would be the 6 criteria of what it means to be ready to learn. And how does this view of learning readiness reconcile with the conversations we have for the last decade in policy, right, in systems changing in early childhood? And again, I think it takes conversations to really think about how these come together. I would imagine many of you may be familiar with the goal of 3rd grade reading proficiency. Right? In fact, that reading by 3rd grade has been one of the most important slogans or goals for many organizations, including our own. Right? But I would imagine, right, if you dial back time and you think about if reading by 3rd grade is a challenge, the policy actions, ideally, logically, would go in 2 directions. One is to help children become more ready from 3rd grade down. 2 is to strengthen our system so that from 3rd grade up, all those children who can't read by 3rd grade are supported and gradually learn to read. As opposed to shifting much of the burden and responsibilities and pressure downward earlier and earlier to the teachers that are most under-resourced and underpaid, to assign them the responsibility for fixing what might be a problem at 3rd grade. And there are no neurological bases, as far as I know, why a child at 3rd grade who can't read must fail. There's no neurological basis for that. It's an artificial construction of the way we built our school systems. That we have this distinction between learning to read before 3rd grade and reading to learn from there on. And if a child can't read, and if the expectation is they must read to learn, for example, the child may be mathematically gifted, but they can't read the word problem from 3rd grade on. Unless you give them the support, they seem like they're struggling in math. But that is not a neurological problem. That is a system problem. For early childhood providers, we're probably more familiar with the word gap debate. The word gap is a study in the 1980s that tracked a small group of parents of different income strata. And the word gap is important, or has been important for policies, in part because of these lines. That it shows that for a young child before the age of 3, the number of words the child understands or can express shows a big gap depending on social class or income, right? Favoring, of course, the college-educated, higher income families versus lower income families. And the word gap has triggered a whole bunch of policy and programmatic initiatives, right? From public awareness campaigns to all the way down to word pedometers that parents and teachers can wear so that it counts the number of words that you say. But I just want to show you a different diagram that looks very similar, but has different meaning. This is another chart of word gap in the language development studies. The word gap chart here, just looking at the shape, right, have a similar shape to the previous one. But this chart tells a different story. There's no low-income families in this chart. Every parent in this chart are white, college-educated, and upper income. This is the word gap within college-educated, white, upper-income families. And there's still a word gap. Now where does that leave us? It's easy to fall into the narrative that it must be the low-income families and the low-income children who are struggling. But what about this? And what the studies here was able to show that for parents on both lines, they say about the same number of words, same caliber words to the children on both lines. The difference is that the children who gets the vocabulary sooner, they don't get it because parents said more words to them or bigger words to them. They got it because parents more frequently responded to the nonsense words that the children were making. It's not how much input you throw in there, it's how responsive you are. And if we understand the research at that level, we may have to rethink some of our initiatives and some of our policies. And all of that is to get back to this idea of what is important in early childhood and what is important in the work that all of us are doing and supporting. And it's worthwhile, even in this age where we have bipartisan support for early childhood development, to re-examine and ask the question, what is the goal of early childhood development? In 1983, when Mr. Rogers was here in Atlanta, this was the key theme of his keynote address to the National Association. And that was an era where much was changing around the world. We had the first Apple computer. We have the first Microsoft Word. Time magazine put computer as person of the year for the first time. And emojis were invented. And I bet you didn't know emoji had to be invented, but they were, by a doctoral student at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. But this was Fred's message. In our Orwellian age, more and more children are being exposed to fancier and fancier machinery. Many schools are using computers in their children's daily routines. But no matter how helpful they are as tools, and of course they can be very helpful tools, they don't begin to compare in significance to the teacher-child relationship, which is human and mutual. A computer can help you to learn to spell hug, but it can never know the risk or the joy of actually giving or receiving one. And I think Fred got a standing ovation in 1983 here in Atlanta from the educators from around the country for that. I wanted to share with you just a tribute that Fred paid to early childhood educators. And juxtaposed with the words of the tribute are actual footage when we worked in our urban neighborhoods, actual footage of childcare providers in very low resource communities working with the children that they have. And we try to capture what we think is the essence of what is important in early childhood. That yes, letters and numbers can be a part of it, but it's not all of it. And in fact, it's not even that big part of it.
In the day-to-day routine of feeding, diapering, changing clothes, supervising play, wiping tears, it's often hard to remember how essential your adult presence is in the lives of the children who come to you for care. Above all, it's your being there that matters most. It's the gift of your honest self that makes the biggest difference in your children's lives. I sometimes wonder if, as caregivers, you ever realize how extremely important you are. You know, none of us can ever be fully aware of the whole story of any child who comes to us. All that's happened at home, all that's going on inside each little body and mind. What we can know is that every one of us, young or old, longs to be cherished.
That story wasn't gonna be.
You say I love you, just by being there when things are sad and scary, just by being there, being there, being there, to say I love you. You'll find many ways to say I love you. You'll find many ways to understand what love is. Many ways, many ways, many ways to say I love you. I thank you for the way you help children feel welcome by the giving of your own special care and by the receiving of the unique care your children give to you. There's no better gift. I wish you well in all the caregiving and receiving of your life.
And to close, I just wanted to sum up the constant and unchanging message that Fred had since the beginning of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood all the way to now. It's the world that around the neighborhood that have changed. It's us who have to now answer the question that Mrs. Joanne Rogers asked of us, what are you going to do now? And how do you reconcile these visions of early childhood development? In 1971, so this was at the very beginning, Fred had in a speech to the American Academy of Child Psychiatry. And in it, he talked about, it's easy to convince people that children need to learn the alphabet and numbers. There are too many reasons to enumerate, all ranging from it'll help them when they get to first grade to we've got to use these early years to getting as much as we can because the Russians will really get ahead of us if we don't. How do we help people to realize that what matters even more than the superimposition of adult symbols is how a person's inner life finally puts together the alphabet and numbers of his outer life? What really matters is whether he uses the alphabet for the declaration of war or the description of a sunrise, his numbers for the final count at Buchenwald, which is a Nazi concentration camp, or the specifics of a brand new bridge. And the parting message from Fred in his own life to young students who are graduating from his alma mater, Dartmouth College, in 2002, that was the final commencement speech he gave in life. We found the parting message in a little note, in his handwritten note. And in the commencement speech, he was ending the speech by talking about, for all these years, when on the television he says, "It's you I like, you make this day a special day by just being you," what he meant by that. And in 2002, the few months before he died, he wrote that, "When I say it's you I like, I'm talking about that deep part of you that allows you to stand for those things without which humankind cannot survive. Love that conquers hate, peace that rises triumphant over war, and justice that proves more powerful than greed." And that is the message that connects my little town of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood to the neighborhood of Dr. King right here. And I just wanted to thank you all for making your neighborhood a beautiful day. Thank you. So we have time for conversation, for questions. You can tell I don't have the answers. These are the things that we struggle with on a daily basis. But we have some time, and please feel free. I think we have microphones that goes around too.
Thanks for coming down. I'm a grandfather, triplet, and I've been drilling on, about these alphabets and numbers and sort of country what they've been telling us. The thoughts about that, if we want to write the next day before next month. So, are we going in the right direction? Should I change what I'm doing? Or that kind of thing?
And that's a great question. I think when my children were young, both my children were adopted, so they were developmentally delayed in the very beginning. And we worked on a lot of those things too. And I don't think Fred was ever against helping our children with numbers and letters and so on. Fred was wary of the idea that these things overtake what is meaningful in the entirety of children's development. And that particularly when it comes to educational policy, it's often those who are from low-income neighborhood and ethnic minorities, these children, whether they're young or they're in school, miss out on more of the childhood that many other groups take for granted. Right? And so as much, we have to kind of exist and live and survive in the system as it is. And if we have a system that possibly declares children as unready when they enter kindergarten just because they couldn't read or count, then we have to do everything we can to help them. But it also means that even while we're doing that, we understand that there are much bigger things, the kind of growing on the inside that Fred was talking about, that they won't be able to learn from an app or even a worksheet, that they would have to learn from you, a human being, that only human beings can teach them things like right and wrong, a sense of justice. Right? And these are the things that only you, the parent, the grandparent, the teacher can do.
Well, this is just a comment. Well, I'm very touchy because I grew up with children and Mr. Rogers. But the very word education comes from educe, I'm sure you know that. And educe means to bring out, not to stuff in. And kids, they have so much, they're ready to have it brought out. We just have to, you know, a kid will say, that's a drum. And you say, oh, no, that's a table. Oh, no, it's a hideout. You know, those qualities that allow them to be innovators, it's the same old world for everyone. The one who sees it from a different way has the creative breakthrough, and that really is the difference between profit and loss. That's just a comment. Thank you.
I think Fred very much believed that each and every one of us have something to bring and to give, and especially children, and that we have to create opportunities for them to give, right? As opposed to for them to always feel like they're at a deficit for whatever expectations that we have.
I love your presentation. Mr. Rogers is the coolest guy ever. But I wonder what he would say, I guess we'll never know for sure, about the amount of television children are exposed to. This vehicle, this medium for education was through television, and yet would he be proud and happy with what television has done to children over the years?
So on that, we have a pretty firm answer, because Fred talked about it towards the end of his career in life. One of my favorite lines from Mr. Rogers' neighborhood is, turn off the neighborhood. And even for the neighborhood. So this is what I loved about Fred, what Fred said about television, which can apply to technology very easily, no matter what kind of technology that we have. Fred said that the television is the only appliance where the best use of it comes when it's turned off. And he doesn't mean you should turn it off permanently. He just meant you turn it on for what you need, for example, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or some other program. But then you turn it off, because the best use happens when the children and the adults in their lives start to integrate and talk about it. That's the part that's far more valuable, far more meaningful than the television program alone. That he even thought that even when it comes to the neighborhood, that it's about turning it off and talk about it at home. That's what makes the neighborhood work. It's not the program itself. And it goes back to Fred's fundamental conviction that we learn and grow best through real human relationships. He always reminds children that I am just your television neighbor, right? And that whatever issue he talks about on the show, whether it's crime, whether it's divorces or death in the family or death of a pet, he would say, I wonder if you have some grown-ups near you that you can talk about it. And that Fred's nonprofit was not called so-and-so media production company. From the 1970s onward, it was called Family Communications. And that was the goal. That was the mission. It wasn't about producing television programs. It was about facilitating communications within the family. And television was how he chose to do it. And Fred was deeply disappointed towards the end of his life that he did not change television for children overall. He did all he could within the confines of his program, but he was not able to transform the television industry itself, particularly when it comes to commercializing and marketing to children.
To follow up on that, in my work, I visit health departments to engage children and parents with print literacy, and I observe how many children are perfectly content and not in need of some other stimulation because their parent has handed them a video on a smartphone. I'm curious to know what your center might be working on now, and in particular, thinking about your comment that the best thing happens after the television is turned off, wondering how we can address this generation of parents who are raising children with their smartphone apps to communicate about that. Is there anything going on, and any advice there?
So the center for the last 6 or 7 years have worked with the National Association for the Education of Young Children, one of which is a joint position statement on what should therapy, what role should digital media play in children's lives? And the center is about to have our symposium focused on how do we then engage parents in that message. But I think, thinking of Fred's messages, so Fred had done a lot of work and even produced television specials in which he works directly with parents. So we're trying to understand kind of how Fred would have approached it, right? There was not a problem. Well, I guess television would have been a problem at that time, but social media and apps are not. I think one of the things I imagine that Fred would do very well is that he would not judge the parents. He would try to listen and understand what are the needs and the fears that drove parents into doing precisely that. We can't deny the fact that the parents are doing that, but what we need to understand is why. Right? And sometimes, yes, the assumption is that the parents find it easy and convenient. Right? But there are other times where parents don't feel particularly confident that they can teach their children. And when these apps are marketing themselves as educational in one way or the other, parent was willing to trust that. Right? There are other times that parents feels under-equipped to draw their children's attention when all their children demand is that. And all parents, I think, has this fundamental desire that we want to make our children happy. That's what makes us feel like competent parents. And for parents who are struggling for one reason or another, whether it's income or other issues, right? There are very few things they can do to make their children happy, and this could be one of those. So there's a host of reasons, many of them non-pejorative, as to why parents may be doing that. And that we can't really reach out to parents, engage them, without first listening and understanding it. And one of the things I talk to Mrs. Joanne Rogers often about is when she's not just throwing the question right back at me and say, what are you gonna do? She says, well, Fred would listen. Almost no matter what I ask her, she says, well, Fred would listen. Right? And I think if we start by doing that, we may have good ideas of how do we partner with parents to have technology, to give them the empowerment so they feel like they can make meaning out of technology rather than let technology make meaning for them.
First of all, thank you for the presentation tonight. I have to tell you, you raised me to tears. I'm very, very passionate child lover and early childhood advocate. I worked in the field for 17 years. I got a degree that all the problems that going on in early childhood education moved me to go back to school and get a degree in early childhood education, 0 to 5. And still work in the field and don't think I will ever move until so long I can walk. Everything what the studies beside the school and everything what I had to do, I educate myself and keep doing it every single day to learn. I come from different countries, from different cultures, and I moved to another country, to another culture, and then came to the United States, had to learn third language. To wrap all of this, and you say like what we need to do, I think we as a society, we have to think about the value of a child. We can value any resource we have in this country, which we do. We have a lot of resources, but I think the children are just undervalued. If a herd of elephants can take care of a baby elephant as a family for about 4 or 5 years, orangutan mama can carry a baby orangutan for 6 years on her back to make her grow strong. I wonder, why do we in this society make children grow up too fast, move up too fast, and be just ready to be their own personalities, be their own individuals before they're ready for that? In a psychology class, I had a big conversation with my professor because he said statistically it's proven that children make people unhappy and marriages fail apart because of children. I think that's a big statement. At the end of the class, I asked my professor to go home, to lay down on the bed and think twice, is he going to teach that class again? With all of you tonight, it is really like all the natural resources everything what we have, technology, everything, doesn't mean anything if we don't have grown-ups, adults who are responsible to take care of that. And with the valuing a child, with teaching people in the society, the children are actually our most valuable jewels. We are not going to move any further. And I think this is something that you can think about. What can we do? We all, you in your position, I do it every single day. With the parents I engage in a conversation, with everybody that comes along, I always stay for a child. That we can always give them their own space and time. Thank you.
And I think I just wanted to echo one of the things that Fred said earlier in that kind of almost an ironic statement that he made in 1967, talking about how we value children for who they will become, not who they are right then and there. And I think the question is, for each of our work, right, no matter where we work, it's not even a question of do we value children or not, but why do we value children? Right? Do we value them because they're future consumers, or they're the engines of future economy or competitive global competition, or do we value them because we want to help them to become confident, competent, and caring human beings, to be part of this world?
Hi, I just wanted to say something real quick. This is an iPhone. This is a 6-year-old. And he has been perfectly content and happy. Can I show the drawing? Using an iPhone as a device. Isn't that cool? He's been drawing for an hour and a half. I'm just saying, I love technology. And you can use it in all kinds of different ways. And I work with young children.
That's right. And part of our center's work is about kind of carrying on Fred's legacy that no advances, whether it's scientific or technology, is inherently good and bad. Right? It's this how we use it that gives it meaning and gives it purpose within our families, within our schools, and around the world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really can think of no better message as we kind of look at the holiday season and are surrounded kind of by these beautiful decorations, and if you look outside, then thinking about our relationships and how our relationships matter. And that message that you left us with about what's simple and deep is so important, especially now when we look at what we want to accomplish here in Georgia with our teaching and our children and family engagement, than to look at what's simple and deep and about how relationships matter. We've brought in other speakers before, and I remember some of our best speakers have afterwards, people have said to me, you know, that's what my grandmother always said. and I was so struck by looking at some of that early footage of Mr. Rogers and the examples that you showed of the teachers. And those are the interactions, those simple interactions that we want today. That when they're at a child's level, when they're talking to children as if they really matter, and some of the work that you taught this morning in the workshops about how responsiveness matters. It's things that we know, but we need to be reminded, and we need to think about how to make those more simple, but really deeper. And if nothing else, I hope that you'll leave today inspired to do more of that on your own. So thank you for coming. In addition to being inspired to build better and stronger and deeper relationships with the children in your own lives and those with whom you work, I hope that you'll also be inspired to take action. We're looking at a legislative session starting just after the new year in January, and one of GEEARS' biggest emphasis and biggest priorities is going to be ensuring that all children in the state of Georgia have access to affordable and high-quality childcare, and that takes an investment. on the state's part, on the federal government's part, on our private philanthropy's part. And what we hope is that you will take the time between now and the beginning of the General Assembly session in January to write your legislators. And if you don't know who your legislators are, please make sure you know the names of your state representatives and state senators. And write them and tell them how important early learning is to you, and why affordable, accessible, high-quality childcare is important to the children that you serve in your lives. We have sample letters if you want them. You have fact sheets that many of you picked up on the child care subsidy program, but if you can take the time between now and then just to write a letter to your legislators about why this work is important, we would deeply appreciate it. So with that, I thank you. I wish you a very happy holiday season and a very safe trip in this cold, wet day, and lots more rain for the plants. So thank you very much.